In 1874, Friedrich Nietzsche gazed at a herd of cattle and felt envious. He saw that these animals lived entirely in the present moment. They had no concept of yesterday or today, and because of that, they were entirely shielded from boredom, regret, and melancholy. Nietzsche imagined a frustrated man standing in that field asking an animal, "Why do you not speak to me of your happiness?" The animal wants to reply, "Because I always forget what I was going to say." But before it can speak, it forgets that answer too. This is a scene from Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations. Nietzsche felt that German society at the time was so obsessed with hoarding history, archiving the past, and cataloging information that it suffocated human happiness, vitality, and creativity. He argued that historical knowledge is useless and even harmful unless it serves the purpose of living. And he wrote, "Forgetting is essential to action of any kind, just as not only light, but darkness too is essential for the life of everything organic." So, if you had to choose, would you rather be a happy animal that remembers nothing or an unhappy human being who is unable to forget anything? Well, fortunately, we never have to make that choice. Scientists have proven that cattle do, in fact, have memories, while we as human beings can never achieve a perfect flawless recall, because forgetting is like our biological instinct. It's like a protective shield that keeps our brains from drowning in an overload of information. But over half a century later, Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges decided to conduct a literary experiment. He's kind of asking, what happens if that biological shield is stripped away? He imagined a man who was gifted, or cursed rather, with a perfect memory, and his name was Funes. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about Borges' short story, Funes, His Memory. The story is written as a memoir or perhaps a tribute. It's narrated by an anonymous intellectual from Buenos Aires who recalls a deceased friend, a teenage boy from a small town in Uruguay named Funes. But right at the beginning, the narrator admits that he has no right to use the word recall. After all, he is just an ordinary human being with an ordinary, imperfect memory, and the only person who ever truly deserved to use the word, he says, is already dead. And we soon realize that person is Funes. The narrator met Funes only a handful of times. Their first encounter was in 1884 when he was spending the summer in Fray Bentos, and that's like a riverside town in Uruguay. Returning from a horseback ride with his cousin, he saw a boy running from the top of a broken wall. And when asked for the time, the boy replied instantly without looking at a watch, 4 minutes till 8. His cousin explained that this was Funes. He's like a local eccentric. He shied away from people, but he always knew the exact time, like a clock. And 3 years later, the narrator returned to Fray Bentos and asked what had become of the strange young man. But he learned that Funes had been thrown from a half-broken horse and left permanently paralyzed. This struck him as a cruel irony because, the last time he had seen Funes, the boy was running freely on top of a wall, but now he is like a prisoner confined to a cot in a dark room, staring for hours at a spider web or the leaves of a fig tree. Yet, according to townspeople, Funes was such a proud young man that he pretended his disastrous fall had actually been a blessing. At the time, the narrator was studying Latin and he had brought a suitcase full of books with him. And soon he received a letter from Funes. The young man politely recalled their brief encounter several years ago and asked to borrow one of the Latin books along with a dictionary, as he wanted to teach himself Latin. In order to disabuse Funes, he sent over the dictionary and the most difficult book in his collection, Pliny's Natural History. And shortly after, the narrator received an urgent telegram asking him to return to Buenos Aires because his father was gravely ill. Before leaving Fray Bentos, he stopped by Funes' house to retrieve the books. When he arrived, the room was almost completely dark. From within the darkness came a voice reciting a Latin text from Pliny's Natural History, and it was Funes. Funes said that the 19 years of his life before the accident was like a dream. He had been blind, deaf, muddled, and forgetful. The narrator tried to remind him that he had always possessed an unusually precise memory, but Funes just ignored him. When he was thrown from the horse, he said he lost his consciousness, and when he woke up again, everything was suddenly so rich and clear, and every perception remained permanently fixed in his memory. He could now see everything and forget nothing, and that immobility seemed just a small price to pay. When he looked at the wine glasses on the table, he perceived all the grapes that had been pressed into the wine and all the stalks and tendrils of his vineyard. He remembered the exact shape of clouds he had seen on a particular morning years earlier and could compare them to the veins on the marbled book cover he had glanced only once. He claimed that he himself alone had more memories than all mankind since the world began. Yet he also said his memory was like a garbage heap. And because he remembered everything, he could not abstract. He even invented a numbering system in which every number had its own unique name, say Maximo Perez for 7013, Railroad for 7014, etc. And likewise, he struggled to comprehend how a single word like dog can represent thousands of different dogs, and it irritated him that the dog seen in profile in 3:14 p.m. should bear the same name as the dog viewed from the front at 3:15 p.m. His memories were so overwhelming that he found it hard to fall asleep. He could only sleep by imagining a part of town he had never visited. He had effortlessly learned English, French, Portuguese, and Latin, but the narrator says he was not very good at thinking because to think is to ignore or forget differences, to generalize, to abstract, while in Funes' mind, there was nothing but an endless flood of precise, hyper-vivid details. As the pale light of the dawn finally entered the room, the narrator saw Funes' face clearly for the first time. Though only 19 years old, he looked ancient, monumental as bronze, older than Egypt. The narrator felt uneasy in his presence as he knew that every gesture or facial expression would remain forever in Funes' perfect memory. 2 years later, in 1889, Funes died of pulmonary congestion. So that's basically the plot of the story. And, at first I thought the narrator was in some ways Borges himself because, he's an educated man from the big city, Buenos Aires, and the slight condescension he occasionally displays toward Funes feels like Borges poking fun at his own intellectual vanity. But Borges said on several occasions that the story was a metaphor of his own insomnia. So according to him, he is actually more like Funes. For example, in a 1976 interview, he said, "When I suffered from insomnia, I tried to forget myself, to forget my body, the position of my body, the bed, the furniture, the 3 gardens of the hotel, the eucalyptus tree, the books on the shelf, and the streets of the village, the station, the farmhouse. And since I couldn't forget, I kept on being conscious and couldn't fall asleep. Then I said to myself, let us suppose there was a person who couldn't forget anything he had perceived. And it's well known that this happened to James Joyce, who in the course of a single day could have brought out Ulysses, a day in which thousands of things happened. I thought of someone who couldn't forget those events and who in the end dies swept away by his infinite memory. In a word, that fragmentary hoodlum is me, or is an image I stole for literary purposes but which corresponds to my own insomnia." So maybe both Funes and the narrator contains something of Borges, and in fact, when Borges was once asked which of his characters he felt closest to. He said he had never really created any character at all. It was always the same old Borges, only slightly disguised. And I think perhaps we can all relate to that experience of insomnia. Like our minds seem to fill with endless thoughts and memories. We try to push them away and they just keep coming back. And interestingly, Nietzsche actually made a very similar connection in Untimely Meditations. And by the way, we are talking about the second essay in this collection called On the Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, where Nietzsche compares excessive memory to a kind of sleeplessness. And he writes, "A man who wanted to feel historically through and through would like one forcibly deprived of sleep, or an animal that had to live only by rumination and ever-repeated rumination." And I think it is highly likely that Funes' story was inspired by Nietzsche because Nietzsche actually imagines a man who has completely lost the ability to forget. Imagine the extremest possible example of a man who did not possess the power of forgetting at all and who was thus condemned to see everywhere a state of becoming. Such a man would no longer believe in his own being, would no longer believe in himself, would see everything flowing asunder in moving points, and would lose himself in the stream of becoming, like a true pupil of Heraclitus. He would in the end hardly dare to raise his finger. Well, we all know that Heraclitus is famous for declaring that everything flows. He famously stated that no one ever steps into the same river twice, because the water is constantly moving. The current you step into at 1 second is entirely different from the current of the next. And also, I think in a sense, we are also constantly changing, right? We are not the exact same biological or psychological entity we were like a minute ago. But for us, this stream of becoming is masked by our imperfect brains. We ignore those minor changes so the world stays stable. We see a tree, a dog, a face, and assume that they remain essentially the same from one moment to the next. But Funes is exactly what Nietzsche calls a pupil of Heraclitus. He witnesses a world that is constantly dissolving and reshaping itself every second, as Borges writes. His own face in the mirror, his own hands, surprised him every time he saw them. Swift wrote that the Emperor of Lilliput could perceive the movement of the minute hand of a clock. Funes could continually perceive the quiet advances of corruption, of tooth decay, of weariness. He noticed the progress of death, of humidity. So it's like he is drowning in the stream of becoming. And that is why he feels irritated that the dog seen in profile at 3:14 p.m. should bear the same name as the same dog viewed from the front at 3:15 p.m. And this actually leads to another point I want to make about this short story. It's about how our language system is shaped by the way we perceive the world. So in this short story, Borges explores a philosophical idea known as nominalism, which is the opposite of realism. Philosophers like Plato argued for a realist view where universal concepts have a real existence independent of our minds and language. General ideas like dog, triangular, or justice are not merely labels we invent. They are eternal and perfect realities, which Plato called forms or ideas. And the individual things we see in the world are imperfect copies of these universal forms. But for nominalists, these universal concepts are products of the human mind, and they argue that only particular individual things exist, and categories like dog or tree are just names that human beings create in order to organize and make sense of the world. So in the story, the narrator explicitly mentions John Locke, who shared this nominalist view, and Locke imagined a language in which every single individual thing, every stone, every bird, every branch, would have its own unique name. But he then dismissed the idea because human memory could never hold that many words, and more importantly, communication would become impossible. Language in its very nature requires us to generalize in order to communicate. We have to ignore countless differences between individual things and group them under common concepts. As Locke put it, species and genre are the workmanship of the understanding. And Funes pushed that thought experiment to an even further extreme because he perceived the constant changes of everything in the world, so he wanted a unique name not only for every leaf on every tree, but also for every single time he had perceived or imagined that leaf. And this project failed as well because he found it both endless and pointless. He realized that even by the time he died, he would not have finished classifying all the memories of his childhood. The narrator says Funes' projects were stupid, but they offered us a glimpse of the dizzying world Funes lived in. To the narrator, Funes seemed to be pathetic. He judges Funes as being incapable of thinking, and he delivers that verdict. To think is to forget differences, to generalize, to abstract, and because Funes' mind is an endless avalanche of details, the narrator assumes he is intellectually paralyzed. And when Funes dies of pulmonary congestion at the young age of 21, it feels metaphorically like he was choked to death by the sheer weight of his own exploding consciousness. But, I am always wondering, is Funes really a tragic figure? If concepts and categories are merely products of the human mind, could it be that Funes simply doesn't need that kind of generalization and abstraction? After all, these may just be defense strategies our imperfect brains use to navigate an infinitely complex world. The narrator describes Funes as the solitary, lucid spectator of a multiform, momentaneous, and almost unbearably precise world. I think that sounds less like a disability and more like an omniscient, almost godlike perspective. So could it be that Funes is the only person who sees the world as it is, in all its infinite richness and detail? The rest of us are forced to simplify, characterize, and distort reality in order to make it manageable. And if that is the case, who is the narrator to look down from his flawed human perspective and pity in mind that can behold the universe in its raw, magnificent, and unvarnished splendor? And this actually reminds me of Lulu Miller's White Fish Don't Exist. Not sure if you've read it. It's been popular for a while, but I've only recently read it, and I think it has some very interesting and thought-provoking ideas. So Miller explores the life of David Starr Jordan, who is a 19th century taxonomist who was obsessed with discovering, naming, and cataloging every species of fish on Earth. He was so dedicated to this mission that even after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake destroyed his laboratory and scattered his specimens, he took a needle and sewed the 10 name tags directly into the skin of the fish that he could still identify so that they could never lose their names again. But modern evolutionary biology eventually revealed that the category of fish is actually an illusion. For instance, the lungfish shares a much more recent common ancestor with land-dwelling, four-limbed animals than it does with ray-finned fish like salmon. So, in other words, a lungfish is more closely related to a cow or even a human than it is to a salmon. So to create an honest family tree, you either have to accept that humans and cows are also fish, or admit that fish is just a lazy shorthand we invented because our limited brains cannot handle the full complexity and fluidity of nature. And Miller writes that Jordan's obsession with naming and classifying fish was really driven by a desire to create order in a world governed by chaos. And I think perhaps all human beings share that same kind of impulse. We want to impose patterns on the universe. We want to sort things into categories and draw boundaries between them. But what if nature itself contains no such order? And there are a few lines in this book that I think gets to the heart of this idea. Consider the word order itself. It comes from the Latin ordinum to describe a roll of threads sitting neatly in a loom. In time, it was extended as a metaphor to describe the way that people sit neatly under the rule of a king, general, or president. It was only applied to nature in the 1700s under the assumption, a human fabrication, a superimposition, a guess, that there is an orderly set of ranks to find there. And actually Jordan wasn't only obsessed with naming and classifying fish, he was also one of the leading advocates of eugenics in the United States. So the same impulse that drove him to classify nature also drove him to classify human beings. And, in his writings, he grouped together all the people he believed should be removed from society, like the poor, alcoholics, the mentally disabled, the morally depraved, under a single category called the unfit. And I think this exposes a darker side of categorization, because when we divide the world into neat boxes, we are not always uncovering natural truths. Sometimes we are satisfying a desire for hierarchy and control. Categories can become tools for deciding what is superior, what is inferior, whether in our understanding of nature or in the organization of society. And that is why Miller continues to write, I have come to believe that it is our life's work to tear down this order, to keep tugging at it, trying to unravel it, to set free the organisms trapped underneath. That it is our life's work to mistrust our measures, especially those about moral and mental standing, to remember that behind every ruler there is a ruler, to remember that a category is at best a proxy, at worst a shackle. So back to Funes' memory, I kind of feel that the narrator is doing something very similar to what David Starr Jordan did, although in a much subtler way. Right from the beginning, he ironically remarks, unfortunately, I am Argentine and so congenitally unable to produce the dithyramb that is the obligatory genre in Uruguay, especially when the subject is an Uruguayan. Highbrow, dandy, city slicker. Funes did not utter those insulting words, but I know with reasonable certainty that to him I represented those misfortunes. So in the narrator's mental taxonomy, he is like the educated, sophisticated city dweller from Buenos Aires, while Funes is merely a street tough from a small Uruguayan town. And I think there's a sense of superiority there, and he is probably aware of it. And we see this most clearly when he receives the telegram from home about his father's illness. God forgive me, but the prestige of being the recipient of an urgent telegram, the desire to communicate to all Freementals the contradiction between the negative form of the news and the absoluteness of the adverbial phrase, the temptation to dramatize my grief by feigning a virile stoicism, all this perhaps distracted me from any possibility of a real pain. And I think this sense of superiority, this, elitism, kind of distorts his ability to judge Funes objectively. Like when Funes announces his desire to learn Latin, the narrator finds the ambition almost laughable for a poorly educated country boy. And when Funes enthusiastically explains his numbering system, the narrator doesn't seriously attempt to understand it, and instead he responds by showing off his own formal mathematical knowledge. And eventually he makes the judgment that Funes is incapable of thought. And to think, he argues, is to forget differences, to generalize, to abstract. But what if the narrator is wrong? What if he just needs Funes to be inferior? He needs to label Funes' project as stupid, because if Funes isn't broken, then the narrator's entire civilized, structured, and neatly categorized world is an illusion. So throughout the story, we see he repeatedly classifies, labels, and ranks the world around him. He places people into categories like Argentine and Uruguayan, educated and uneducated, civilized and rustic, and perhaps fewness represents a challenge to that entire way of seeing. If categories are not natural truths but human constructions, if they're just tools we use to impose order on a reality that may ultimately resist it, then fewness's inability to categorize isn't really a tragic defect. And instead, it may be a kind of liberation. He is the only one who has broken free from those conceptual shackles, the only one who has stepped outside of the cages of human language and glimpsed the world as it is. And I think we only need to look at how the narrator responds to earlier critics to see how badly he needs fewness to be a tragic figure rather than someone, superior to him. Pedro Leandro Ipucha has written that fewness was a precursor of the race of Superman, a maverick and vernacular Zarathustra. And I will not argue the point, but one must not forget that he was also a street tough from Fray Bentos with certain incorrigible limitations. And again, Borges is invoking the philosophy of Nietzsche. And thus spoke Zarathustra, the prophet Zarathustra descends from the mountain to teach humanity about the Superman. And the Superman here isn't the caped comic book superhero we are familiar with today, but rather he represents Nietzsche's ultimate goal for human evolution. And Nietzsche, speaking through Zarathustra, famously declares, man is a rope fastened between an animal and Superman, a rope over an abyss. The Superman rejects collective traditional beliefs to embrace absolute individuality and self-realization. And this concept is also closely linked to Nietzsche's amor fati, the love of fate, and the eternal return, which demands that you embrace every single moment of existence without wishing a single detail were different, even if your life were to, repeat in an endless cosmic loop. But the journey of Zarathustra is dangerous and lonely. After spending 10 solitary years in the mountains and achieving enlightenment there, Zarathustra decides to leave the mountain and descend into the chaotic marketplace to share his wisdom. But instead of listening to his wisdom, the masses mock him and dismiss him. When Zarathustra had spoken these words, he looked again at the people and fell silent. There they stand, he said to his heart. There they laugh. They do not understand me. I am not the mouth for these ears. And I think in a sense, fewness's experience is very similar to that of Zarathustra because, fewness is physically trapped in his dim little room, just like Zarathustra in his mountain cave. And yet he perceives the infinite complexity of the universe. And he attempts to share his staggering raw reality of what he perceives with the narrator, but instead of listening to him, the narrator mocks him, pities him, and looks down on him. And I think deep down, the narrator recognizes fewness's, terrifying greatness because after all, he knows that he will not argue the point that fewness might literally be a vernacular Zarathustra, but yet he immediately adds that one must not forget that he was also a street tough from Fray Bentos with certain incorrigible limitations. So it is as if the narrator is trying to remind us and perhaps also remind himself that fewness isn't really that special. He wants to assure us that even if this rural boy possesses some extraordinary power of perception, he is just a rough country boy at the end of the day, and he is entirely unworthy of being compared to Nietzsche's prophet. And in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche also introduces the idea of the last man, or the ultimate man, who represents the exact opposite of the Superman. And he is the final product of herd mentality, entirely obsessed with trivial comfort, safety, entertainment, and complacency. And the ultimate man wants life to be easy, small, and completely predictable. He despises greatness because greatness is disruptive and terrifying. And when Zarathustra tries to warn the crowd about this pathetic future, the crowd interrupts him. "Give us this ultimate man, O Zarathustra," so they cried. "Make us into this ultimate man. You can have the Superman." And all the people laughed and shouted. But Zarathustra grew sad and said to his heart, "They do not understand me. I am not the mouth for these ears." And I think the narrator refuses to recognize fewness as a true Zarathustra, perhaps because that would mean admitting his own mediocrity, because for all his education and sophisticated city pride, the narrator is ultimately just one of the crowd, a comfortable, complacent member of the herd. He dismisses fewness's profound cosmic awareness as incapable of thought, but perhaps he couldn't even fully comprehend fewness's mind. He was never the right ears for fewness's mouth. And interestingly, I think the narrator actually drops some subtle hints that his narration might not be entirely reliable. He admits that he met fewness no more than 3 times, and there is a stark contrast in the language he uses to describe the first and last of those meetings. Their first encounter was before fewness's accident, back when he was still just an ordinary boy, and the narrator confidently states, "My first collection of fewness is quite clear." But when it comes to their last meeting, the narrator says, "I come now to the most difficult point in my story, a story whose only raison d'etre, as my readers should be told from the outset, is that dialogue half a century ago. I will not attempt to reproduce the words of it, which are now forever irrecoverable. Instead, I will summarize faithfully the many things Iraniel told me. Indirect discourse is distant and weak. I know that I am sacrificing the effectiveness of my tale. I only ask that my readers try to hear in their imagination the broken and staccato periods that astounded me that night." And this actually reminds me of Borges's another short story, The Aleph, where the protagonist encounters a point in a cellar that contains every point in the universe. And in that story, the narrator says, "I come now to the ineffable center of my tale. It is here that a writer's hopelessness begins. Every language is an alphabet of symbols, the employment of which assumes a past shared by its interlocutors. How can one transmit to others the infinite Aleph, which my timorous memory can scarcely contain?" Ludwig Wittgenstein famously said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." And in a way, fewness was like a human version of the Aleph. His mind was an infinite, ineffable event, so when the narrator complains about the broken and staccato periods that astounded him that night, maybe it wasn't that fewness's sentences were vague, but that the narrator's ordinary brain simply couldn't process infinity. And this brings to the ultimate paradox of the story. Language is just a social contract. It's a set of generic symbols built on a shared understanding of the world, and it relies on abstraction and categorization. To say the word dog, we have to ignore the infinite differences between every individual dog that has ever existed and the completely different way that specific dog looks at every single passing second. In other words, human language is structurally unable to express the infinity of the universe. And since fewness is incapable of abstraction, our everyday language system is completely useless to him. So I think we have to ask that impossible question. How did they actually communicate that night? How did fewness even begin to describe the infinity he was saying to the narrator? And honestly, I think Borges himself may not have an answer either. In his stories, whenever a character unravels the secret of the cosmos, something strange just happened to them and prevent them from fully expressing it to the rest of the world. Like in the Library of Babel, in that infinite universe of hexagonal galleries, The librarian spent generations hunting for a bookman, someone who has supposedly read the single book that contains the key to all books, yet they can never find him. And in the writing of the god, when a prisoner trapped in a pyramid deciphers the magical script of the universe, he chooses complete silence. He just lies in the darkness, allowing the days to forget him. So finally, I still want to ask that same question. Is Funes really a tragic figure? I mean, he is paralyzed, trapped in a dark room, and dies at the age of 21. And it seems as though the relentless flood of details eventually crushes him. And that's, certainly how the narrator wants us to see him. But for someone who had more memories than all mankind since the world began, does the physical length of life even matter? Perhaps Funes experienced more reality in 21 years than most of us could in 100. And perhaps he embraced every moment so completely and saw every detail so vividly that he inhabited a richer universe than the rest of us ever will. After all, it is we, the ordinary people, who are standing before a chaotic cosmos that we struggle to decipher, lamenting that our lives are so limited while the knowledge of the universe is endless. We call Funes a tragedy because we cannot imagine living in his world, but maybe Funes would have looked at ours and felt exactly the same. So that's all I want to say about this short story. You may not agree with me, and that's perfectly okay. I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.